"I'll never marry you or accept this baby," the millionaire raged. But 9 months later, one hospital door broke his heart open. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter Family. May the Almighty crown every woman with unshakable courage, quiet strength, and a peace that guards her day and her dreams. May every tear become a seed of new blessings, and every hidden ache turn into a river of divine comfort. You are the backbone of love, the shelter in storms, and the voice that keeps hope alive, even in silence. May kindness follow your footsteps, may grace rest on your shoulders, and may your soul never lose its light. My precious family, don't let your voice fade tonight. Your presence keeps this home warm. A like is a prayer of unity. A comment is a flame of love that never dies. This is Mission 1000 likes for every woman who holds pain quietly, fights battles softly, and still rises beautifully. If you walk with love, like this video. If your heart stands in faith, comment, "I'm with Mr. Peter." The words left his mouth like bullets, each one designed to kill something inside her that had been foolishly, desperately alive. Stephen Hamner stood with his back to the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, the city skyline stretching behind him like a kingdom he'd been born to rule. His reflection in the glass showed a man who looked carved from ice, every line of his expensive suit perfect, every dark hair in place, his jaw set in that way that made junior executives tremble during board meetings. He couldn't turn around. If he turned around and saw Shanda Miller's face, saw those eyes that had once looked at him like he was more than his last name and his bank account, he might break. And Stephen Hamner had been taught since childhood that breaking was not an option. Shanda's voice came from somewhere behind him, small and trembling in a way he'd never heard before. She was always so confident, so brilliant, the kind of architect who could redesign an entire commercial complex in her head and sketch it on a napkin with such clarity that contractors wept with gratitude. She'd been with his firm for 2 years, in his bed for 8 months, and in his heart for longer than he'd ever admitted to anyone, including himself. But 30 minutes ago, his mother, Constance Hamner, had stood in this exact spot, her perfectly manicured hands folded over documents that might as well have been a death sentence, and explained with brutal clarity exactly what Stephen's choices were. "Stephen, please look at me." Shanda's words barely registered over the roaring in his ears, over his mother's voice still echoing through his skull like a curse. "I know this isn't what we planned. I know the timing is terrible, but we can figure this out together. We love each other. That has to count for something. Love." The word tasted like ash in his mouth. His mother had shown him photographs of the Whitmore oil heiress, Priscilla, a woman with cold intelligence in her eyes and a smile that never reached past her perfectly whitened teeth. She'd shown him contracts that would merge 2 empires, documents that would secure Hamner Industries for generations. And then she'd shown him the other documents, the ones that proved his cousin Blake had been systematically embezzling company funds, creating shell corporations, preparing to launch a hostile takeover that would destroy everything Stephen's grandfather had built from nothing, everything his father had died protecting when a heart attack took him at 49, because the stress of maintaining a legacy was a weight that crushed men who carried it. "Marry the Whitmore girl by the end of the month," his mother had said, her voice as warm as a blade pressed against skin. "Or watch Blake dismantle this company piece by piece. The board is already questioning your leadership. They see you as soft, distracted. They've noticed how you look at that architect, how you've been unavailable for important meetings because you're having dinner with someone who will never understand our world. Choose, Stephen. Choose your responsibility or choose your weakness." He'd chosen. God help him, he'd already chosen before Shanda walked through his door with that little white stick in her trembling hands and hope dying slowly in her beautiful eyes. "I'll never marry you or accept this baby." The words came out mechanical, rehearsed, each syllable a knife he was driving into both of them. "You knew what this was, Shanda. We had an arrangement. I have responsibilities, a legacy that's bigger than what I want. You're talented, incredibly talented, but you're not. He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say the words his mother had used. Not suitable, not our kind, not enough. The silence that followed was so profound, Stephen could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the sound of something precious shattering. When Shanda finally spoke, her voice had gone completely flat, all the warmth and life drained out of it like blood from a wound. I see. 2 words. That was all. She moved in his peripheral vision, setting something on his desk with a soft click. The pregnancy test, physical evidence of a future he was murdering before it could take its first breath. I understand perfectly, Mr. Hamner. Thank you for your clarity. The formality in her tone, the way she'd called him Mr. Hamner like he was a stranger, like the past 8 months had been erased in a single conversation, made something crack in his chest. He wanted to turn around, wanted to pull her into his arms and tell her he was sorry, that he was a coward, that his mother had poisoned everything beautiful in his life since he was 15 years old. But his feet stayed frozen, his reflection in the window showing him exactly what he was becoming. His mother, cold, calculating, sacrificing love on the altar of legacy. Shanda's footsteps crossed his office, each click of her heels on marble, another nail in a coffin he was building for his own soul. The door opened, closed, and Stephen was alone with his choice and the ghost of jasmine perfume that always clung to her skin. He stood there as the sun set over the city, as the lights began to flicker on in buildings full of people living smaller lives that probably held more joy than his ever would. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother. The Whitmore merger papers were ready for his signature. The engagement announcement was drafted for the business section of every major newspaper. His calendar had been cleared for a family dinner where he'd meet his future wife and pretend that his heart wasn't bleeding out somewhere on the floor of this office. Stephen finally turned from the window and saw the pregnancy test on his desk, that tiny piece of plastic that represented everything he'd just destroyed. He picked it up with shaking hands, those 2 pink lines stark and undeniable. Positive. A baby. His baby. A child he'd just rejected before it even had a chance to exist in his world. He should throw it away. He should call his assistant and have her draft Shanda's termination paperwork, make it clean and professional, offer a generous severance package to ease his conscience. He should sign the merger documents and move forward with the life that had been planned for him since birth. But instead, Stephen opened his desk drawer and placed the pregnancy test inside, closing it like he was sealing away the last piece of his humanity. That night, in his empty penthouse apartment, Stephen signed papers that would bind him to a woman he didn't love and secure a legacy that suddenly felt like a prison sentence. He poured himself scotch that tasted like regret and stared at his phone, his finger hovering over Shanda's name in his contacts. He could call her. He could tell her he'd made a mistake. He could choose differently, but he didn't, because Stephen Hamner had been raised to believe that duty mattered more than desire, that sacrifice was noble, that real men protected empires even when it cost them everything that made life worth living. He didn't know that Shanda was in her apartment at that exact moment, her sister Janelle, screaming into a phone for an ambulance as blood soaked through everything, as pain ripped through Shanda's body in waves that felt like dying. He didn't know that doctors would use words like placental abruption and critical condition and might lose them both. He didn't know that his child would be born months too early, 1 pound and 11 ounces of fighting spirit, struggling for every breath in a plastic box while machines breathed for him. He didn't know that his rejection had nearly killed them both, and by the time he found out, it would be far too late to undo the damage his cowardice had caused. Chapter 2. The Ghost in the Hospital. Stephen Hamner had been raised to believe that guilt was a weakness, but standing in that hospital corridor, he understood it was actually a living thing that could eat you from the inside out. The pediatric wing smelled like antiseptic and desperation, a combination that made Stephen's stomach turn as he walked toward the conference room where the hospital board was waiting to discuss his latest charitable donation. Hamner Industries had pledged millions to expand the NICU facilities, and Stephen was here to smile for photographs and shake hands with administrators who saw him as a walking checkbook rather than a man whose soul had been hollowed out over the past months. His engagement to Priscilla Whitmore had been announced in every business publication that mattered, complete with photographs of them looking elegant and empty at charity galas. The wedding was planned down to the last expensive detail, scheduled for a date that was approaching with the inevitability of an execution. Priscilla was exactly what his mother had promised. Intelligent, sophisticated, utterly pragmatic about what their marriage would be. She told him over champagne at their engagement party that she expected him to be discreet with his affairs, that she would extend him the same courtesy, that they would present a united front in public and live separate lives in private. It was everything his mother wanted and nothing his heart could survive. But Stephen had made his choice, had signed his name to documents that felt like signing away his humanity, and now he was just going through the motions of a life that belonged to someone else. He was heading toward the conference room when he passed a large window that looked into the NICU, and his entire world stopped turning. She was there, Shanda Miller, sitting in a rocking chair with a baby so small it looked impossible, so fragile that Stephen's breath caught in his throat. She was thinner than he remembered, her beautiful face drawn with an exhaustion that went bone-deep, dark circles under eyes that had once sparkled with laughter, and now held only a fierce protective love as she gazed down at the infant in her arms. The baby was connected to wires and monitors, tiny chest rising and falling with breaths that looked like work, little fingers no bigger than matchsticks curled against blankets. Stephen pressed his hand against the glass, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. He knew with absolute certainty that bypassed logic and went straight to his gut that he was looking at his child. The baby had the same unusual grey-green eyes that haunted every dream Stephen couldn't remember when he woke up gasping in the middle of the night. Those eyes, that specific colour that was Shanda's alone, now staring up at her from a face that was both impossibly tiny and impossibly perfect. Shanda was singing something, her lips moving with words Stephen couldn't hear through the glass, and the expression on her face was so full of love, it hurt to witness. This was what devotion looked like. This was what real strength looked like. Not board meetings and merger documents and maintaining appearances at society functions, but this woman in a rocking chair holding a baby who looked like he'd been born too soon, fighting battles Stephen couldn't begin to understand. A nurse approached Stephen from behind, her voice professional but kind. "Sir, visiting hours for the NICU are restricted to immediate family only. Are you here for the board meeting?" Stephen couldn't speak. His throat had closed around words that wouldn't come. The nurse followed his gaze through the window and her expression softened. "That's Samuel Miller. He's been here since he was born. Quite a fighter, that little one. His mother hasn't left his side except to shower and handle necessities. Most devoted parent I've seen in 30 years of NICU nursing." Samuel. His son's name was Samuel, and Stephen hadn't known he existed. Hadn't known that Shanda had been here, in this hospital, for months while he'd been planning a wedding to another woman. Hadn't known that his child was fighting for his life while Stephen was attending engagement parties and smiling for cameras. Stephen found his voice, though it came out rough and broken. "How long has he been here?" The nurse checked her tablet, her expression going cautious, as if she sensed she was walking into territory that wasn't her business. "Since birth. He was born very premature after a catastrophic medical emergency with his mother. 28 weeks gestation. He's gained good weight, and his prognosis keeps improving, but babies born that early need extensive hospital care." The words hit Stephen like physical blows. Catastrophic medical emergency. 28 weeks. Born months too early. His mind was doing calculations he didn't want to complete, timeline matching up with the night he'd rejected Shanda in his office. She'd left his office and something terrible had happened, something that put both her and their baby in mortal danger, and he'd known nothing about it. He'd been signing merger documents while Shanda was hemorrhaging. He'd been announcing his engagement while his son was being born too small to survive outside machines and medical intervention. Stephen tried to enter the NICU, but the nurse stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. "I'm sorry, but you need to be on the approved visitors list. Hospital policy. The baby's mother controls who has access." Stephen wanted to argue, wanted to use his name and his money and his position to force his way through, but something stopped him. He had no rights here. He'd thrown away any claim to rights when he'd told Shanda he would never accept their baby. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and called his assistant, the one who could find information about anyone, who could pull strings and make impossible things happen. Within an hour, Stephen had a full report. Samuel Miller had been in the hospital since birth, fighting for survival while accumulating medical bills that would crush most people. Shanda's insurance, which should have covered catastrophic neonatal care, had denied most claims on technicalities that made Stephen's blood run cold. She'd been living in a tiny apartment 3 blocks from the hospital, working freelance projects remotely to pay for expenses insurance wouldn't cover, spending every moment she could in the NICU with their son. And Stephen had known nothing. Had been living his carefully constructed life while Shanda was drowning, while his son was fighting battles that babies shouldn't have to fight. He stood outside the NICU window until the sun set, watching Shanda rock Samuel, watching her wipe tears from her own face when she thought no one was looking, watching her hold their son with hands that trembled from exhaustion but never wavered in their gentleness. Other families came and went. Other babies were brought to mothers and fathers who sat together in shared vigil. Shanda sat alone. She'd been alone through all of this because Stephen had chosen duty over love, legacy over family, and now the weight of that choice was crushing him. Stephen was about to leave, to go home and figure out what to do with information that had shattered his carefully maintained denial, when he saw someone stepping off the elevator. His mother. Constance Hamner, dressed in designer clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent, walking toward the NICU with purpose in every step. Her face was calm, composed, but Stephen knew that expression. He'd seen it before when she was about to destroy someone who'd gotten in her way. Terror flooded through him, cold and absolute. His mother was here. His mother knew about Samuel. And if Constance Hamner was walking toward Shanda and his son with that look on her face, it meant she was about to do something that would leave destruction in her wake. Chapter 3. The Mother's Betrayal Revealed. There are moments when you discover that the foundation of your entire life was built on lies, and those moments don't come with warnings or mercy. Stephen followed his mother through the hospital corridors, keeping enough distance that she wouldn't notice him, but close enough to intervene if necessary. His heart was hammering against his ribs, adrenaline flooding his system with the sick certainty that whatever was about to happen would change everything. Constance moved through the pediatric wing like she owned it, her heels clicking against linoleum with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything she wanted. A nurse tried to stop her at the NICU entrance, but Constance produced identification that made the nurse step back immediately. Board member credentials. Of course. His mother sat on half the hospital boards in the city, used her charitable donations as leverage to access spaces normal people couldn't reach. Stephen watched through a small window as his mother was directed to a private family consultation room, the kind used for difficult conversations about prognosis and treatment options. Moments later, Shanda was escorted into the same room, her expression confused and wary. She was wearing clothes that had seen too many washes, jeans that hung loose on a frame that had lost too much weight, a sweater with a small stain on the sleeve that suggested she'd been feeding Samuel and hadn't had time to change. She looked exhausted and beautiful and terrified, and Stephen's hands clenched into fists as he moved closer, positioning himself where he could see through the window but not be immediately visible. His mother's mouth was moving, words Stephen couldn't hear but could imagine from the way Shanda's face went progressively paler. Constance was calm, measured, every gesture calculated for maximum impact. She pulled something from her purse, a phone, showing Shandar images that made the younger woman's hand fly to her mouth. Then Constance pulled out her checkbook, that elegant leather-bound book she carried everywhere, and wrote something with the same expensive pen she'd used to sign Stephen's life away to Priscilla Whitmore. She slid the check across the table between them like it was a business transaction, like she was negotiating a contract rather than trying to buy off the mother of her grandchild. Stephen burst through the door just as Shandar tore the check into pieces, her hands shaking with fury. "Get away from her!" His voice came out dangerous, a tone he'd never used with his mother before. Constance turned to him with an expression of mild surprise, as if his presence was unexpected but not unwelcome. "Stephen, perfect timing. I was just explaining to Miss Miller here that her attempts to extort our family won't be tolerated." Constance's voice was smooth, reasonable, the voice she used in boardrooms when she was dismantling opponents. "She's been harassing us with claims that her premature baby is yours, threatening to go to the media if we don't pay her off. I've offered her a generous settlement to sign a non-disclosure agreement and disappear, but she's being quite unreasonable." The lies were so smooth, so perfectly delivered, that for a heartbeat Stephen almost believed them himself. Almost fell back into the pattern of trusting his mother's version of reality over his own instincts. But then he looked at Shandar's face, saw the devastation written there, the way she'd gone completely still like an animal that knows it's been trapped. "That's not true." Shandar's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through Constance's performance like a blade. "I never contacted you. Not once. Not ever. I disappeared after Stephen made it clear he wanted nothing to do with us. I changed my number, moved apartments, resigned from the firm without explanation because I didn't want this." Her hand gestured between them, encompassing the hospital, the confrontation, the nightmare that her life had become. "I didn't want Samuel to grow up feeling unwanted the way I felt my entire childhood. I didn't want your money or your acknowledgement or anything from your family." Stephen moved to stand beside Shandar, his body positioning itself between her and his mother without conscious thought. "Tell me the truth, Mother. All of it. How long have you known about Samuel?" Constance's mask flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. She'd known. She'd known for months, maybe longer, and she'd said nothing while Stephen planned a wedding to the wrong woman and Shandar suffered alone. "I had your assistant followed after your behavior became erratic following the breakup." Constance's tone suggested this was perfectly reasonable, standard business practice. "I needed to know if that woman posed a threat to the Whitmore merger. When I discovered she was pregnant, I made sure to monitor the situation. After the baby was born prematurely, I assumed nature would take its course. When it didn't, I took steps to ensure she remained focused on her child, rather than on trying to claim a place in our world." The casual cruelty of those words hit Stephen like a physical blow. "What steps?" His voice had gone deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded explosions. Constance sighed like he was being difficult. "The insurance denials were necessary to keep her financially desperate and too busy to cause problems. The loss of her freelance contracts was simply business contacts being made aware that hiring her would displease Hamner Industries. Nothing illegal, Stephen, just strategic resource management." Shandar made a sound like she'd been punched, her hand reaching out to steady herself against the wall. "You destroyed my insurance claims? Samuel's medical bills were denied because you intervened?" Her voice was rising now, months of exhaustion and terror finding focus in rage. "My son needed specialized care. He had infections, setbacks, complications. I've been choosing between his treatments and keeping a roof over our heads because you decided we weren't worthy of basic human decency." Stephen's world was tilting, everything he'd believed about his life crashing down like buildings in an earthquake. His mother hadn't just known about Samuel, she'd actively worked to harm him, to make sure Shandar was too overwhelmed to reach out for help, to keep Stephen's son suffering because acknowledging his existence would have complicated the Whitmore merger. His mother, who'd raised him on lectures about family legacy and responsibility and honor, had nearly killed his child to protect a business deal. "You're finished," Stephen's voice was shaking but absolute. "You have no son anymore. You have no access to my life or my decisions. You're done controlling me." Constance's confident mask cracked, her eyes going wide with something that might have been fear. "Stephen, think about what you're saying. The Whitmore merger, the company, your position as heir. Blake will destroy everything if you don't follow through." Stephen felt something break loose inside him, chains he hadn't even known he was wearing suddenly shattering. Then let him destroy it. Let the whole empire burn if it was built on this kind of evil. Let Blake have the company and the board and the legacy that requires sacrificing babies to maintain itself. I want no part of it. He turned to Shanda, trying to find words that could possibly express what he was feeling. "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. I should have fought for you, for Samuel. I should have told her no from the beginning. I should have been there when you needed me." But Shanda was already moving toward the door, her face closed off, her eyes empty of everything except exhaustion. "I don't want your apologies," she said quietly. "I don't want your money or your guilt or your sudden realization that your mother is a monster. Samuel and I survived without you. We'll keep surviving without you." She looked at him one more time, and the expression in her eyes made Stephen want to die. "You made your choice. She just made sure it was easier to live with." Shanda walked out before Stephen could respond, and he stood frozen in the consultation room with his mother, the woman who'd shaped his entire life, who'd taught him everything he knew about duty and sacrifice and what mattered in the world. Constance was watching him with calculation in her eyes, already planning her next move, already figuring out how to regain control. "If you walk away now, you lose everything," she said, her voice hard. "The company, your inheritance, your position in society. You'll be starting over with nothing but a woman who resents you and a baby who will never fit into the world you were meant to rule." Stephen looked at his mother and finally saw her clearly, saw the emptiness behind all that elegant composure, the void where love should have been. "I already lost everything when I listened to you instead of my heart. Samuel and Shanda are the only things that matter now. And you're going to stay away from them, or I will make sure every newspaper, every business publication, every hospital board knows exactly what you did. Stay away from my family." He left his mother standing alone in that consultation room and walked out into the hospital corridor, his legs barely holding him up. Through the NICU window, he could see Shanda back in the rocking chair with Samuel, her face pressed against their son's head, her body shaking with silent sobs. Stephen pressed his hand against the glass one more time, separated from his family by barriers he'd helped build, and made a promise that he would spend the rest of his life trying to tear those barriers down. Chapter 4. The Distance. She built. Stephen Hamner was a man who'd spent his life making billion-dollar deals, but he couldn't negotiate his way past the door of a woman who'd learned to survive without him. The text message to Priscilla Whitmore was brutally simple. "The engagement is over. I'm sorry. You deserve honesty, and the truth is, I can't marry you." Her response came within minutes, surprising in its relief rather than anger. "Thank God. I've been in love with my publicist for years and didn't know how to tell you. Good luck with whatever made you finally wake up." Stephen stared at that message for a long time, understanding that even his fake relationship had been built on layers of pretense that suffocated everyone involved. The call to his lawyer was longer, more complicated. Cancel the wedding, draft documents acknowledging paternity of Samuel Miller, establish a trust fund that would secure his son's financial future regardless of what happened with Hamner Industries, transfer enough money to cover every medical bill Shanda had accumulated, every insurance claim his mother had sabotaged, every night she'd gone without because she was choosing between her needs and Samuel's care. His lawyer tried to warn him about the legal implications, about how publicly acknowledging the baby could impact the Whitmore merger and the company's stock price. Stephen interrupted him with words that felt like freedom. "I don't care. My son comes first. Make it happen." But none of it reached Shanda, because she'd built walls that Stephen's money couldn't scale. His calls went straight to voicemail. His emails bounced back with automated responses. The nurses at the NICU were kind but firm when they told him that Shanda had given explicit instructions that Stephen Hamner was not to be given information about Samuel's condition or allowed access to the NICU despite his name now being on birth certificates and legal documents. He'd signed papers acknowledging paternity, had transferred ownership of a penthouse apartment into Shanda's name, had lawyers draft custody agreements that gave her complete control while offering him supervised visitation if she ever chose to allow it. But legal documents meant nothing when the woman he'd destroyed wouldn't even look at him. Stephen found himself haunting the hospital like a ghost, sitting in waiting rooms near the NICU during the times he knew Shanda would be with Samuel, hoping for a glimpse of them through windows, hoping for a chance to explain or apologize or grovel. He watched other families come and go, watched fathers hold their premature babies with the same terrified reverence he felt for a son he'd barely seen. He watched Shanda through the glass, her hands so gentle as she changed tiny diapers and adjusted monitor wires and held Samuel against her chest in the kangaroo care that helped premature babies thrive. The love in her face was so powerful it hurt to witness, and Stephen understood with crushing clarity that Samuel had that love because Shanda had chosen it despite everything. She'd chosen their son when Stephen had rejected him, and that choice had saved Samuel's life. On a particularly bad day, Stephen finally tracked down Shanda's sister Janelle, catching her in a coffee shop near the hospital. Janelle looked at him with the kind of controlled fury that suggested she was imagining multiple ways to hurt him and settling on words only because they were legal. She sat down across from him with coffee she didn't touch, her arms crossed, her expression making it clear this meeting would be brief and painful. 5 minutes, Janelle said flatly. Then I'm leaving, and you're going to stop stalking my sister's schedule. Stephen nodded, his throat tight. He needed to understand, needed to know what he'd done, the full scope of damage his cowardice had caused. Tell me what happened, that night after I rejected her. Tell me everything. Janelle's eyes went cold. You want details? Fine. Shanda came home from your office and collapsed in her apartment within an hour. Placental abruption, the doctors said later. Catastrophic bleeding that happens when the placenta tears away from the uterine wall. She was hemorrhaging, dying, and all she could say in the ambulance was that if something happened to her, I should promise never to tell you about the baby. She made me swear it while blood soaked through everything and paramedics were radioing ahead that they might lose her before reaching the hospital. The coffee shop sounds faded away, the world narrowing to Janelle's voice describing a nightmare Stephen had caused. They performed an emergency cesarean at 28 weeks to save her life. Samuel came out weighing 1 pound, 11 ounces. The doctors gave him a 30% chance of survival. They told Shanda when she woke up in the ICU that her son might not make it through the night. She just almost died, her body was destroyed, and she was being told her baby might not survive. And you know what the first thing she saw when they finally let her into the NICU was? Newspapers announcing your engagement to some oil heiress. Photographs of you smiling at charity galas while her son was fighting for every breath. Stephen's hands were shaking, coffee spilling over the rim of a cup he didn't remember picking up. I didn't know. I would have been there if I'd known. Janelle laughed, a sound without humor. Would you? Or would you have made the same choice your mother wanted, swept it under the rug, paid Shanda off to keep quiet? Because that's what she believed, that even if you knew, even if Samuel was dying, you'd choose your precious legacy over your own child. The words hit like bullets, each one finding a target Stephen couldn't defend. Janelle continued, her voice getting harder. I watched my sister live in this hospital for months, sleeping in chairs that destroyed her back, pumping breast milk every 3 hours because it gave Samuel antibodies he desperately needed, eating vending machine food because she couldn't afford both meals and parking fees. I watched her hold Samuel while he stopped breathing and had to be resuscitated. I watched her celebrate every ounce he gained like it was a miracle, because for him it was. I watched her fight your mother's insurance sabotage, taking on extra freelance projects at 3 in the morning while Samuel slept, trying to keep up with medical bills that would crush most people. Janelle pulled out her phone, swiping through photos Stephen wasn't sure he had the right to see. Shanda, pregnant and glowing, her hand on her belly, her smile bright with anticipation. Shanda in a hospital bed looking grey and broken, tubes and wires everywhere, her eyes closed in unconsciousness. Samuel impossibly tiny in an incubator, so many wires attached to his small body he looked more machine than baby. Shanda holding Samuel for the first time, both of them connected to medical equipment, her face wet with tears and filled with love that transcended suffering. "She loved you so much it nearly killed her," Janelle said, putting her phone away like she regretted showing him. "She used to talk about you like you were something special, like you saw her differently than everyone else did. She believed in you, believed you'd choose love over money when it mattered, and you proved her wrong in the cruelest way possible. So no, Stephen, you don't get to suddenly decide you want to be involved now. You don't get to throw money at the situation and call it fixing things. Shanda built a life without you because she had to. She built walls to protect Samuel from ever feeling rejected like she felt growing up without a father. Those walls are there for a reason." Janelle stood to leave, and Stephen felt panic claw at his throat. "Please, tell me how to fix this. Tell me what to do." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened just slightly. "I can't tell you that. But I can tell you that Shanda made me promise something else that night in the ambulance. She made me promise that if you ever tried to be part of Samuel's life, I'd make sure you understood what real commitment meant, not showing up when it's convenient or throwing money at problems or making grand gestures that cost you nothing, but being there in the boring moments, the terrifying moments, the moments when there's no audience and no reward except knowing you did right by your child. Can you do that, Stephen? Can you be the father Samuel deserves, not the guilty stranger trying to ease his conscience?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and Stephen met Janelle's eyes with the first honest answer he'd given anyone in months. "I don't know if I can be what he deserves, but I'm going to spend every day trying, whether Shanda ever forgives me or not. Samuel is my son and I failed him once. I won't fail him again." Janelle nodded slowly, something like respect flickering across her face. "Then prove it, not to me, not to Shanda. Prove it to yourself first. Because the only way those walls come down is if she sees you're not the man who rejected her. And that kind of change doesn't happen overnight." She walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Stephen alone with photos he couldn't unsee and truth he couldn't unknow. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt something other than guilt. He felt determination. Chapter 5. The fight for access, power, and money could buy almost anything in Stephen's world, but they couldn't buy forgiveness, and they definitely couldn't buy back time. Stephen stopped trying to force his way into Shanda's life and started simply being present instead. Every morning he showed up at the hospital, not to the NICU, but to the administrative offices where he'd volunteered his business expertise to help restructure their funding programs. He sat through budget meetings and grant applications, using the skills his mother had drilled into him for something that actually mattered. The hospital administrators were grateful for his help, confused by his sudden interest in pediatric care funding, but Stephen didn't explain. He just showed up day after day, making himself a fixture in the building that housed his son. The nurses began to recognize him, started nodding when he passed in the hallways, stopped looking at him with suspicion when he sat in the family waiting room near the NICU during times he knew Shanda would be with Samuel. He never approached her, never tried to force conversation, just worked on his laptop or read medical journals about premature infant care, educating himself on what Samuel was fighting through. He learned terms like apnea of prematurity and retinopathy and bronchopulmonary dysplasia. He learned that every day Samuel survived was a victory, that every ounce gained was cause for celebration, that the journey from NICU to home was measured in tiny milestones that looked insignificant to outsiders but meant everything to parents living this particular nightmare. Stephen started leaving things at the nurse's station, not flowers or gifts that screamed of guilt and money, but practical things. Real food from restaurants Shandar used to love, left anonymously in bags with her name on them, gift cards to grocery stores, to gas stations, to places that would ease the financial burden she was carrying. The nurses knew who the items were from, but respected his request to not mention his involvement. He wasn't trying to buy forgiveness. He was trying to prove that caring didn't require acknowledgement or credit. The first real crack in Shandar's walls came on a terrible night when Samuel had a sudden setback. Stephen was in the waiting room working on hospital budget projections when alarms started going off in the NICU. Medical staff rushed past him, and through the window he saw them surrounding Samuel's incubator, saw Shandar pushed back by nurses who needed room to work, saw her face go white with terror that Stephen felt in his own chest, like a physical wound. He stood frozen, watching his son fight for life, while machines beeped warnings and doctors shouted orders he couldn't hear clearly. Shandar burst out of the NICU minutes later, her body shaking so hard she could barely walk. She collapsed into a waiting room chair, her face in her hands, sobs tearing out of her throat with sounds that made Stephen's heart crack open. He didn't think, just moved to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, but not quite. For long minutes she didn't acknowledge him, just cried, with the kind of grief that comes from months of holding terror inside and finally breaking under the weight. "They found an infection," she finally whispered, her voice destroyed. "His blood work showed sepsis. They're starting aggressive antibiotics, but he's so small, so weak already. The doctor said the next few hours are critical." Her hands were shaking, her entire body vibrating with fear. Stephen's hand found hers without asking permission, and for the first time since he'd destroyed them, Shandar didn't pull away. She held onto him like he was the only solid thing in a world that was collapsing, and they sat together in that waiting room for 6 hours while Samuel fought an infection that could have killed him. When the doctor finally emerged with news that Samuel had stabilized, that the antibiotics were working, that he'd turned a corner, Shandar sobbed with relief so profound she couldn't breathe. Stephen's arm went around her shoulders, pulling her against his chest, and she let him hold her while she fell apart. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was just two parents sharing the terror of almost losing a child, and in that moment, the walls between them thinned just enough for Stephen to remember what it felt like to have her trust him. After that night, something shifted. Shandar began tolerating Stephen's presence in ways she hadn't before. She didn't talk to him beyond necessary communication, but she stopped leaving rooms when he entered them. She accepted the food he left at the nurse's station, stopped returning gift cards unopened. When Stephen approached the NICU charge nurse about supervised visitation with Samuel, Shandar didn't fight it. She set strict rules and boundaries, made it clear that Stephen's access was a privilege she could revoke at any moment. But she let him in. The first time Stephen held his son, he thought his heart might actually stop. Samuel was so small in his arms, still connected to monitors that tracked every breath and heartbeat, his little body warm and impossibly precious. Stephen looked down at grey-green eyes that were learning to focus, at tiny fingers that wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength, and understood what unconditional love actually meant. Not duty or obligation or legacy, but this helpless, overwhelming need to protect this small person who existed because Stephen had once been brave enough to love Shandar before fear made him cruel. "He has your stubborn streak," Shandar said quietly from her chair across the room, the first words she'd spoken to him that weren't logistics or boundaries. "The nurses say he's a fighter, refuses to give up even when things get hard." Stephen's throat was too tight for words. He just nodded, tears streaming down his face as he held his son and tried to memorize every detail. The weight of him, the sound of his breathing, the way his little chest rose and fell with effort that was getting easier as he grew stronger. They fell into a careful routine after that. Stephen would arrive during evening visiting hours, would sit with Samuel while Shandar took breaks to eat real meals, or shower in the hospital facilities, or just breathe air that didn't smell like antiseptic and fear. He learned how to change tiny diapers, how to hold Samuel in the specific way that calmed him, how to read monitor numbers and understand what they meant about his son's condition. He learned from nurses how to do kangaroo care, holding Samuel skin to skin against his chest, feeling his son's heartbeat against his own, and understanding that this connection was biological and profound, and worth more than every dollar in his bank account. Weeks passed in this fragile peace, and Stephen watched Samuel grow stronger, watched him graduate from his isolette to an open crib, watched him learn to regulate his own temperature, watched him take bottles with increasing efficiency. Every milestone was a victory. Every day without setbacks was a gift, and Stephen was there to witness it all. He was there when Samuel smiled for the first time at Shandar's voice, when he grabbed his own toes, when he hit weight goals that meant he was one step closer to going home. One evening, after Samuel had a particularly good day where he'd taken a full feeding without assistance, Shandar actually looked at Stephen with something other than pain or exhaustion in her eyes. "Why now?" she asked, her voice quiet but not hostile. "Why do you suddenly care after throwing us away?" The question had been coming for weeks, Stephen knew. It deserved honesty, deserved more than excuses or justifications that would only insult them both. "Because I was a coward," Stephen said, his voice rough with emotion he'd stopped trying to hide. "Because I let my mother's poison control my choices. Because I was raised to believe that duty and legacy mattered more than love, and I didn't question it until I saw what it cost. Because I convinced myself that protecting a business empire was worth more than protecting my own family. Because I was wrong about everything that mattered." He met her eyes, let her see the truth written all over his face. "I don't have good reasons, Shandar. I just have excuses that don't fix anything. I destroyed us because I was too afraid to fight for us." Shandar looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for lies or manipulation, or the man who'd rejected her in that penthouse office. "You don't get to just decide you want us now and expect me to forget everything," she said finally, her voice shaking. "You don't get to traumatize me and then come back like it didn't happen. You don't get to skip past the damage and go straight to redemption." Stephen nodded, understanding that this was the truth they'd been circling around for weeks. "I know. I'm not asking you to forget or forgive. I'm just asking for the chance to prove I'm not that man anymore, to prove that I can be the father Samuel deserves, even if you never trust me as anything else." Shandar stood then, gathering her things to leave, but she paused at the door of the NICU. "Then prove it, Stephen, not with money or grand gestures, but with showing up every day even when it's boring, even when there's no crisis, even when being a parent means just sitting next to your son's crib and being present. That's what matters." She left before he could respond, but something in her voice told Stephen she was actually listening now, actually watching to see if he could be different than the man who'd broken her heart, and that terrified and electrified him more than anything else in his life ever had. Chapter 6. The Slow Thaw. Redemption doesn't come in grand gestures, Stephen learned, but in the quiet accumulation of showing up when it would be easier to walk away. The weeks that followed became a rhythm that Stephen had never experienced in his carefully scheduled life. Every evening he arrived at the hospital at the same time, rain or shine, exhausted from work or fighting through illness, it didn't matter. He showed up. He learned that parenting wasn't dramatic moments, but the mundane repetition of care that built trust through consistency. Changing diapers at midnight when Samuel's schedule demanded it, holding his son during feeding times, learning the specific angle that helped him swallow without choking, reading children's books in a quiet voice while Samuel's eyes tracked the colorful pages with increasing focus. These were the moments that mattered, Stephen discovered, not the trust funds or legal documents, but the simple act of being present. Shandar watched him with eyes that were learning to see something other than betrayal. She watched him arrive during a winter storm when the roads were dangerous, watched him stay late when Samuel was having a difficult night and needed extra holding, watched him learn from nurses with humility instead of throwing money at problems. She watched him hold Samuel during a minor medical procedure that made their son cry, watched Stephen's face crumple with empathy while he murmured comfort into tiny ears. She watched him become a father through the accumulation of small choices, and something in her began to soften despite her determination to keep her walls intact. They began talking during the quiet hours when Samuel slept between them. Not about the past or the damage that still lay raw between them, but about Samuel's progress, about his personality that was emerging as he grew stronger. How he seemed to prefer certain nurses, how he calmed at the sound of Shandar's voice, how he was beginning to smile when he heard Stephen's laugh. These conversations were careful, neutral territory, where they could remember how to be in the same space without pain dominating every interaction. Stephen learned about Shandar's life during the months he'd been absent, and each detail was a knife to his heart. How she'd spent her birthday in the hospital, celebrating with a cupcake from the cafeteria, while Samuel fought through a particularly bad week. How she'd missed job opportunities because she couldn't commit to regular hours while her son's health was unpredictable. How she'd become an expert on neonatal development and medical terminology that no parent should have to learn. How she'd found community with other NICU parents who understood the particular terror of loving a child whose survival was never guaranteed. One evening, Shandar arrived at the hospital looking more exhausted than usual, and when Stephen asked if she was okay, the walls cracked open just slightly. "It's been a year," she said quietly, her eyes on Samuel rather than on Stephen. "A year ago today I was in my apartment, bleeding out, thinking I was going to die, thinking my baby was going to die. I remember being in the ambulance, and all I could think was that Samuel would never know how much I wanted him, how much I already loved him, even though I'd only known about him for a few hours." Stephen's throat closed around words that wanted to come out but felt inadequate. Shandar continued, her voice getting softer. "The doctor told me later that I'd lost so much blood I should have died, that Samuel's chances of survival at his gestational age and birth weight were minimal. But we both lived. We both fought through impossible odds. And I used to wonder if maybe we survived because we needed each other. Because I couldn't leave him alone in the world, and he couldn't leave me alone in the world." She finally looked at Stephen, and her eyes were wet, but not quite crying. "You weren't there for any of it. You didn't hold my hand while they cut me open. You didn't see Samuel fight for his first breath. You didn't spend nights wondering if morning would come with good news or the worst news. You missed all of it because you chose to miss it." Stephen nodded, accepting the truth of her words like blows he deserved. "I know. I can never get that time back. I can never undo missing Samuel's first months of life. I can never fix not being there when you almost died. All I can do is be here now and hope that eventually it's enough." Shandar was quiet for a long time, and then she did something that shocked them both. She reached across the space between their chairs and took Stephen's hand, her fingers threading through his with a familiarity that made his heart stutter. "Samuel smiled at you today. Did you notice? When you were reading to him, he looked right at you and smiled. He's starting to know you're his father. He's starting to trust you." Stephen's vision blurred with tears. He'd stopped being ashamed of months ago. "Does that scare you? That he might love me even though I rejected him?" Shandar's grip on his hand tightened. "Yes, it terrifies me. Because if he loves you and you decide this is too hard, if you walk away again, it will destroy him the same way my father's absence destroyed me. But I'm choosing to believe you won't do that. I'm choosing to believe that the man who shows up here every night, who learned how to change diapers and read monitors and hold his son through scary moments, is the real you, not the man in that office who said terrible things." They sat holding hands while Samuel slept, and Stephen felt something settle in his chest that had been restless since the day he'd rejected Shandar. Hope. Not for redemption or forgiveness, but for the possibility that they could build something new from the ashes of what he'd destroyed. That maybe, if he kept showing up, kept proving his commitment through boring repetition and steady presence, the walls between them might eventually come down completely. The shift in their relationship was subtle but undeniable. Shandar started asking Stephen's opinion on decisions about Samuel's care. She invited him to meetings with doctors where they discussed discharge plans and home care requirements. She showed him how to prepare bottles to Samuel's specific preferences, how to bundle him for comfort, how to read his cries and respond appropriately. She was teaching him to be a father, and in doing so, she was trusting him with the most precious thing in her world. One particularly good evening, after Samuel had been moved to a less intensive section of the NICU because his progress was accelerating, Shandar actually laughed at something Stephen said. The sound was rusty, like she'd forgotten how, but it was real, and it lit up her entire face in ways that made Stephen remember falling in love with her. Not the desperate, complicated love that had ended in tragedy, but something simpler. The way she saw the world with architectural precision but emotional depth. The way she never gave up on things she believed in. The way she loved Samuel with a fierceness that made her beautiful in ways that transcended physical attraction. "What?" Shandar asked, catching him staring. Stephen shook his head, smiling despite the ache in his chest. "Just remembering why I fell in love with you in the first place, before I was too stupid and scared to fight for us." Shandar's smile faded, but not into sadness, into something more contemplative. "I fell in love with who I thought you were. I'm trying to figure out if that person actually exists, or if I invented him." Stephen met her eyes, letting her see the truth he'd been carrying for months. "I think that person existed, but he was too weak to survive pressure. I think maybe I'm becoming someone different now, someone who prioritizes differently. I can't promise I'm the man you fell in love with, but I can promise I'm trying to be the man you and Samuel deserve." Shandar looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that made Stephen's world stop spinning. She leaned across the small space between their chairs and kissed his forehead, a gesture so tender it made him want to weep. "Keep trying," she whispered against his skin. "Keep showing up. Keep being present. That's all I can ask right now." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation or promises about the future. But it was Shandar choosing to let him in, choosing to believe that people could change, choosing to risk hoping again despite everything. And for Stephen, sitting in that NICU with his son sleeping nearby and the woman he loved touching him with something other than pain, it felt like the beginning of something that might eventually heal them all. Chapter 7. The Mother's Final Attack. Constance Hamner had built an empire on crushing anyone who threatened her control, but she'd never faced an opponent who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The morning started with hope that felt almost dangerous in its brightness. Samuel was being discharged. After months of hospital rooms and monitors and medical interventions, he was finally strong enough to go home. Shanda had arrived at the hospital before dawn, her eyes bright with tears that were joy instead of fear for the first time in recent memory. She'd packed the few belongings they'd accumulated during their long stay, had listened to discharge instructions from nurses who'd become like family, had dressed Samuel in an outfit that actually fit his growing body instead of drowning him in fabric meant for full-term babies. Stephen had taken the day off from everything, cleared his schedule completely so he could be there for this milestone. He'd helped Shandar install the car seat that had been checked and rechecked by hospital safety staff, had carried bags and equipment, while Shandar held Samuel like he was made of glass and miracles. They were standing in the hospital lobby, ready to walk through those doors into a new chapter of their lives, when the process server found them. The woman approached with professional courtesy that didn't match the destruction in the envelope she handed Shandar. Legal documents, thick and official, the kind that came from expensive lawyers who charged by the minute to ruin lives. Shandar opened the envelope with one hand, Samuel secured against her chest with the other, and Stephen watched her face go from glowing to grey as she read. Her hands started shaking so badly the papers rattled, and when she looked up at Stephen, the expression in her eyes was pure betrayal. "Your mother is suing me," Shandar whispered, her voice breaking. "She's claiming I'm mentally unstable, that I'm alienating Samuel from his father's family, that I'm financially irresponsible and emotionally unfit. She's filed for emergency grandparent visitation rights. She kept reading, her face getting paler with each page. She has lawyers claiming I trapped you with a pregnancy, that I'm using Samuel as leverage for money, that I'm neglectful and dangerous. They're requesting a psychological evaluation and temporary custody review. Stephen grabbed the documents from her shaking hands, his vision tunneling as he read his mother's poison dressed up in legal language. Constance had assembled an attack that was comprehensive and vicious, using every moment of Shandar's exhaustion and struggle as evidence against her. The fact that she'd lived near the hospital instead of in a larger apartment. Proof of instability. The medical bills she'd struggled to pay. Evidence of financial irresponsibility. The fact that she'd limited Stephen's access for months. Proof she was alienating the child from his father's family. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, taking every sacrifice Shandar had made and twisting it into something ugly. "She can't do this," Stephen said, his voice shaking with rage. "This is harassment. This is revenge because I cut her off. This has nothing to do with Samuel's well-being." But Shandar wasn't listening. She was already moving toward the exit, holding Samuel against her chest like she was protecting him from physical attack. Stephen followed her, calling her name, but she was beyond hearing him. She got into her car, that old vehicle that barely ran but had carried her to the hospital and back for months, and drove away without looking back. Stephen called her phone immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. He called Janelle, who answered with fury in her voice because she'd already heard. Shandar had called her sister from the car, sobbing so hard she could barely speak, saying she was leaving, disappearing before Constance could take Samuel the way she'd threatened. Janelle wouldn't tell Stephen where Shandar was going, hung up on him when he demanded information, and Stephen was left standing in the hospital parking lot with legal documents in his hand, and his family vanishing for the second time because of his mother's cruelty. The call to his lawyer was brutal and immediate. Stephen wanted an emergency restraining order against his mother, wanted her lawsuit dismissed, wanted every legal weapon in his arsenal aimed at destroying Constance's case. His lawyer was cautious, explaining that grandparent rights cases were complex, that Constance's resources and connections meant this would be a real fight. Stephen interrupted him with words that came from somewhere deep and furious. "I don't care what it costs. I don't care what I have to do. My mother tried to kill my son through medical neglect, and now she's trying to take him from his mother. End this." But ending it required finding Shandar first, and she'd disappeared completely. Her apartment was empty, forwarding address filed with the post office but not released to anyone. Her phone stayed off. Her sister maintained hostile silence. Stephen spent days calling in every favor, hiring investigators, searching property records. He was frantic, imagining Shandar alone and terrified, imagining Samuel in some new place without proper medical follow-up, imagining the panic Shandar must be feeling that Constance's reach would find them wherever they went. He finally found them in a small coastal town, hours away from the city, Shandar, renting a modest house under a different name, trying to build a life where his mother's influence couldn't reach. When Stephen showed up at the door, Shandar opened it with Samuel on her hip and fury in her eyes that was purer than anything he'd seen before. "Your mother tried to take my son," she said, her voice shaking with rage that had been building for days. "After everything she's done, after nearly killing him with her sabotage, she had the audacity to claim I'm the unstable one. She tried to use the law to take Samuel from me right when he was finally coming home." Her eyes were blazing, her whole body vibrating with protective fury. "I will burn this entire world down before I let her touch him. I will disappear so completely you'll never find us. I will fight until there's nothing left of me if that's what it takes to keep Samuel safe." Stephen held up a folder, his hand steady despite the terror coursing through him. "I know. And I brought you every document you need to destroy her, every piece of evidence of what she did to you, to Samuel, the insurance sabotage, the deliberate interference with your medical claims, the harassment, all of it. I'm testifying against her in court. I'm giving you everything you need to win." Shandar stared at the folder like it was a snake. "Why would you testify against your own mother?" Stephen met her eyes, let her see the truth written all over his face. Because she's not my mother anymore. A mother doesn't try to kill her grandchild. A mother doesn't weaponize the legal system to terrorize a woman who's done nothing but love and protect her son. Whatever relationship we had ended the moment I found out what she did to you and Samuel. I'm on your side, Shanda. I'm on Samuel's side. And I will spend every resource I have making sure Constance never hurts either of you again. Shanda's hand tightened on Samuel, her eyes searching Stephen's face for lies or manipulation or hidden motives. Testifying against her means destroying your relationship with your family. It means losing your inheritance, your position in society. It means everyone in your world will know you chose us over them. Stephen nodded, his voice rough with emotion. I already lost my family when I rejected you and Samuel. Everything else is just things, just money and position and a legacy built on cruelty. I choose you. I choose Samuel. I choose being the kind of man my son can be proud of, instead of the kind of man my mother wanted me to be. Samuel reached for Stephen from Shanda's arms, little fingers grasping at air, saying Dada with the confidence of a child who'd learned that word meant safety. Stephen's vision blurred as Shanda, after a long moment of internal debate, let him take their son. Samuel curled against Stephen's chest like he belonged there, and Shanda's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back since the process server destroyed their discharge day. If we fight her, she'll make it ugly, Shanda said quietly. She'll air everything. Your rejection of us, my struggles, every moment of weakness I had during Samuel's hospitalization. She'll try to paint me as the villain and herself as the concerned grandmother. Stephen shifted Samuel carefully, reaching out with his free hand to touch Shanda's face. Then let her try. The truth is on our side. And I'm done being afraid of what she'll do or what people will think. I'm done choosing reputation over reality. Fight her with me, Shanda. Let me prove I'm not the man who walked away. Shanda looked between Stephen and Samuel, between the folder of evidence and the door behind them that could lead to more running, more hiding, more living in fear. Then she took a breath that sounded like a decision and reached for the folder, opening it to scan documents that detailed every evil thing Constance had done. Okay, she said finally. We fight. But Stephen, if you betray us again, if you side with her when things get hard, I will make sure you never see Samuel again. I will disappear so thoroughly you'll spend the rest of your life wondering where we are. Do you understand? Stephen met her eyes with absolute certainty. I understand, and I won't betray you. Never again. It was a promise he intended to keep even if it cost him everything else in his life, because the woman standing in front of him and the child in his arms were worth more than empires built on cruelty. Chapter 8. The Truth He Carries. Stephen had always believed that honesty was a luxury, but standing on Shanda's porch with his heart in his throat, he realized it was the only currency that mattered. Shanda didn't invite him inside immediately. She stood in the doorway of the small coastal house she'd rented, Samuel reaching for Stephen with the easy trust of a child who didn't understand complicated adult betrayals, and told him he had 5 minutes to explain why she shouldn't disappear again. Her face was exhausted, dark circles under eyes that had seen too much pain, her body language defensive even as their son babbled happily at the sight of his father. Stephen knew this moment mattered, knew that whatever he said in the next minutes would determine whether his family stayed or vanished forever. I need to tell you the truth, Stephen said, his voice rough. Not excuses or justifications, but the actual truth about why I rejected you and Samuel. The truth about my mother and how she raised me, and why I was too broken to fight for what mattered. Shanda's expression didn't soften, but she didn't close the door either. You have 5 minutes. Stephen took a breath that hurt his chest and started with the beginning, the parts he'd never told anyone because speaking them out loud felt like admitting defeat. My father died when I was 15. Heart attack, they said, but really it was the stress of running Hamler Industries that killed him. He was 49 years old, worked 18-hour days, sacrificed every moment of joy for the company his father built. I watched him die slowly for years before his heart finally gave out. He missed my childhood because he was always at the office. missed my mother's life because she became more business partner than wife. He died believing that legacy mattered more than living. Shandar's face flickered with something that might have been sympathy, but she stayed silent, waiting. Stephen continued, the words coming faster now. After he died, my mother became obsessed, not with grief, but with preserving what he died for. She raised me to believe that love was a weakness that destroyed men, that duty was everything, that personal desires had to be sacrificed for family legacy. She controlled every aspect of my life. The schools I attended, the people I associated with, the career path I followed. I thought it was normal, thought all families operated this way. He paused, the next part harder to voice. I was engaged once before you, in college, to a woman named Amanda. We were going to elope, start a life away from my mother's control, but Constance found out. She destroyed Amanda's family business, used her connections to make sure Amanda's father lost everything. Then she offered him a bailout with one condition. Amanda had to leave me and never contact me again. I came home to find Amanda gone, a note saying she'd made a mistake, and my mother sitting in my apartment with contracts that restored her father's company. She told me that was what love cost. Destruction for everyone involved. Shandar's eyes widened, a small crack in her defensive armor. Stephen pressed on, needing her to understand, even if understanding didn't equal forgiveness. I learned to shut down after that. Learned to have relationships that were surface level, that couldn't be weaponized. I thought you were safe because you were just my employee, just someone I was sleeping with casually. I didn't realize I was falling in love until it was too late to protect you from my mother. He described that morning in his office, how Constance had arrived before Shandar with documents proving his cousin Blake was embezzling, preparing a hostile takeover, how she'd given him an ultimatum: marry into Whitmore Oil, secure the merger that would save thousands of employee jobs and protect the legacy his father died for, or watch Blake destroy everything while Constance gave her blessing because at least Blake understood duty over emotion. She showed me photographs of the Whitmore heiress, contracts that would secure our family for generations, and then she showed me what Blake had done. The shell corporations, the fraud, the systematic dismantling that was already in motion. She said I had to choose between saving the company or choosing my feelings for you. Shandar's voice was quiet when she finally spoke. So you chose the company. You chose money and legacy over us. Stephen shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. I chose fear. I chose what I'd been trained to choose since I watched my father work himself to death. I chose duty because I didn't know how to choose anything else. Your pregnancy announcement came an hour after my mother left, and I was still in shock, still trying to process the choice she'd given me. I said terrible things to you because I was repeating her words, becoming her, destroying what I loved because I was too weak to fight. Samuel was making grabbing motions at Stephen, and Shandar finally relented, stepping back to let him into the house. Stephen walked into the small living room that smelled like baby powder and ocean air, so different from his penthouse or the mansion where he'd grown up. Shandar sat on a worn couch, her posture still defensive, and gestured for him to continue. I didn't know you almost died that night, Stephen said, his voice breaking. I signed merger papers and told myself I'd made the right choice. I announced my engagement to Priscilla Whitmore and convinced myself I was protecting you by staying away. I lived months in a nightmare of my own making, pretending everything was fine while slowly dying inside. He sat across from her, Samuel in his arms, and let her see the truth written all over his face. Then I saw you in the hospital with Samuel. I saw what my choice had cost, saw the months you'd suffered alone, saw our son fighting for his life while I'd been playing business games. Everything my mother taught me, everything I believed about duty and legacy, it all shattered in that moment. Shandar was quiet for a long time, her eyes studying his face like she was looking for lies. Your explanations don't erase what you did, she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. They don't give me back the months I spent terrified and alone. They don't erase the trauma of almost dying, of watching Samuel struggle to breathe, of making choices between his medical care and keeping a roof over our heads. Your mother made you weak, but you were still the one who rejected us. You still said those words that almost killed me." Stephen nodded, accepting her truth like the punishment it was. "I know. I'm not asking you to forgive me or to erase what happened. I'm just asking you to understand that I was a broken man who learned too late what actually mattered. I'm asking you to see that I'm trying to be different now, that I've cut my mother out of my life completely, that I'm fighting to be worthy of Samuel, even if I'll never be worthy of your trust again." Shanda looked at their son, at the way Samuel had fallen asleep against Stephen's chest with complete trust. "I need to tell you my truth too," she said quietly. "My father left before I was born. I grew up watching my mother work herself to exhaustion, trying to provide for us, watching her cry at night when she thought I was asleep, wondering what was wrong with me, that my own father didn't want to know me. I built myself into someone successful, someone worthy, thinking that if I achieved enough, I'd prove I was worth staying for. Then you rejected me and Samuel, and it confirmed every fear I'd carried my whole life, that I wasn't enough, that I'd never be enough." Stephen's heart was breaking as she continued. "When I hemorrhaged that night, when they were cutting Samuel out of me to save my life, all I could think was that my son would grow up with the same questions I had. Why didn't his father want him? What was wrong with him that he wasn't worth fighting for? I made Janelle promise to never tell you about Samuel because I didn't want him to have a father who saw him as an obligation instead of a joy. I almost died thinking that choice was protecting him." She wiped tears from her face, her voice getting stronger. "Then I spent months keeping him alive through sheer force of will. Fighting your mother's sabotage, fighting insurance companies, fighting my own exhaustion and fear. I learned that I was strong enough to do it alone, that I didn't need you to survive. But Samuel needs you. Not your money or your guilt, but he needs a father who shows up consistently, who loves him unconditionally, who will be there through boring homework and scraped knees and teenage drama. Can you be that, Stephen? Can you be the father he deserves, not just now when it's dramatic, but in 10 years when it's mundane?" Stephen stood carefully, moving to sit beside Shanda on the couch with Samuel between them. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be that father. I'm going to make mistakes, probably a lot of them, because I was raised by a woman who saw children as business investments rather than people to love. But I'm committed to learning, to being present, to choosing Samuel over everything else. I can't promise I'll always get it right, but I can promise I'll never stop trying." Shanda looked at him, really looked at him, and Stephen held still under the weight of her examination. Finally, she reached across Samuel's sleeping body and took Stephen's hand, her fingers cold against his. "Your mother called me yesterday," she said quietly. "Before Samuel's discharge, before the lawsuit was served, she told me that you'd eventually regret choosing us, that you'd resent giving up your inheritance and position for a family that would never fit into your world. She said I should take whatever money you offered and disappear because that's what people like me were good for, taking what we could get and knowing our place." Stephen's rage flared hot and immediate. He pulled out his phone, dialed his mother on speaker with shaking hands. When Constance answered, her voice was composed and confident, like she hadn't just tried to destroy their lives. "Stephen, I hope you're calling to tell me you've come to your senses." "Stay away from Shanda and Samuel," Stephen said, his voice lethal and controlled. "Stop calling, stop filing lawsuits, stop trying to control my life. You nearly killed my son through your sabotage. You tried to take him from his mother. You've done enough damage." Constance's laugh was cold. "That woman has manipulated you into throwing away everything your father died to protect. She's not your equal, Stephen. She'll drag you down into mediocrity, and you'll spend the rest of your life resenting her for it." Stephen looked at Shanda as he responded, his words meant for her as much as his mother. "She survived hell because of choices you and I made. She kept our son alive through strength and love that you'll never understand. She's worth more than every dollar in our family accounts, more than every business deal or society connection. You're done, Mother. Stay away from us or I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you did to harm your own grandchild." He hung up before Constance could respond, and Shanda was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. "You really meant that," she whispered. "About me being worth more than your legacy." Stephen cupped her face with his free hand, his thumb wiping away tears. "I meant every word. I gave up a legacy built on cruelty. I found something better. You and Samuel are everything that matters, and I'm going to spend however long it takes proving that to you." Shandar's answer came not in words, but in the way she leaned forward and kissed him, soft and tentative and full of cautious hope that felt more precious than certainty. Chapter 9. The Reckoning in Court. The courtroom wasn't a place for justice, Stephen had learned from years of corporate litigation, but sometimes it could be a place for truth, and truth had its own kind of power. The custody hearing drew media attention that made Stephen's skin crawl. Cameras lined the courthouse steps, reporters shouting questions about family drama and billion-dollar inheritances, and the woman who'd supposedly trapped a business heir with a pregnancy. Constance arrived with an entourage that looked like an invading army. 5 lawyers in expensive suits, character witnesses pulled from society circles, and carefully prepared evidence that painted Shandar as unstable and manipulative. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who'd never lost anything that mattered, her designer clothes and perfect composure suggesting this was just another business negotiation she would win through superior resources. Shandar arrived with Janelle and a single lawyer they'd scraped together funds to hire, her clothes clean but clearly not expensive, her face exhausted but determined. She held Samuel against her chest like a shield, and when photographers tried to get shots of the baby, she turned away with protective fury. Stephen met them at the courthouse entrance, positioning himself between Shandar and the cameras, and the look she gave him was grateful but still wary. They were fighting together, but trust was still fragile between them, still being rebuilt from ruins. The courtroom was formal and cold, wood paneling and high ceilings that made voices echo with importance. The judge was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes that missed nothing, her expression carefully neutral as she reviewed preliminary documents. Constance's lead attorney opened with a presentation that was masterfully cruel, using PowerPoint slides and carefully edited evidence to paint a picture of Shandar as emotionally unstable, financially irresponsible, and deliberately alienating Samuel from his father's family. They showed photographs of Shandar's modest apartment near the hospital, implying she'd chosen inadequate housing instead of accepting help. They presented testimony from a hired psychologist who'd never met Shandar but gave expert opinion about maternal instability based on second-hand information. They displayed financial records showing medical debt and struggled payments, suggesting she couldn't provide proper care. They even showed text messages Shandar had sent to Janelle during particularly difficult nights, messages full of fear and exhaustion that were being twisted into evidence of mental breakdown. Stephen watched Shandar's face go paler with each attack, watched her hold Samuel tighter, watched her try to maintain composure while her worst moments were being weaponized against her. His hands clenched into fists under the table, rage building in his chest until he thought he might explode. This was his mother's work, this systematic destruction of a woman whose only crime was loving their son enough to fight for his survival. When it was their turn to present defense, Stephen's lawyer began methodically dismantling Constance's case. He brought hospital staff who testified about Shandar's devoted care during Samuel's months in the NICU. Nurses who described her sleeping in uncomfortable chairs for weeks, spending every possible moment with her son, learning complex medical care to prepare for his homecoming. Doctors who confirmed that Samuel's survival and thriving development was directly attributable to his mother's consistent, loving presence during critical early months. Then Stephen's lawyer revealed the evidence Stephen had provided. Documentation of Constance's deliberate interference with insurance claims, emails showing her instructing adjusters to deny coverage for Samuel's care. Records of calls Constance had made to Shandar's potential clients, warning them away from hiring her. Testimony from a private investigator about surveillance Constance had ordered, monitoring Shandar's movements and searching for weaknesses to exploit. The systematic nature of the harassment was undeniable when presented chronologically, showing months of calculated cruelty aimed at keeping a mother and child desperate and isolated. The courtroom went very quiet as the judge reviewed these documents, her expression hardening with each page. But the turning point came when Stephen himself took the stand, his lawyer guiding him through testimony that would destroy his relationship with his mother forever. "Mr. Hamner, please tell the court about your relationship with Miss Miller." Stephen took a breath and began speaking truth he should have spoken months ago. "I loved Shanda. We had a relationship that lasted 8 months and she was the best thing in my life. When she told me she was pregnant, I rejected her in the cruelest way possible because my mother had given me an ultimatum: marry into a business merger or lose my inheritance and position in the family company." He described that morning in his office, his voice steady despite the shame burning through him. "I told Shanda I would never marry her or accept our baby. I said things designed to hurt her, to push her away, because I was too much of a coward to stand up to my mother. That same night, Shanda had a catastrophic medical emergency that nearly killed her and resulted in Samuel being born extremely premature. I knew nothing about it because I was busy signing contracts for a wedding to a woman I didn't love." The judge's expression was impossible to read, but Stephen continued, "I didn't know about Samuel's existence for months. My mother knew. She had me followed, discovered Shanda was pregnant, and made the decision to monitor the situation without informing me. When Samuel was born prematurely and spent months in the NICU, my mother made deliberate choices to sabotage his medical care." Constance's lawyer objected loudly, but Stephen's lawyer had documentation to support every claim. Stephen described discovering Shanda and Samuel in the hospital, learning about the months of suffering his rejection had caused, confronting his mother about her interference. He detailed cutting Constance out of his life completely, ending his engagement to Priscilla Whitmore, walking away from his inheritance and position to focus on being the father Samuel deserved. "My mother isn't filing for grandparent rights because she cares about Samuel," Stephen said, his voice getting harder. "She's filing because she lost control of me, because I chose my son over her empire. This lawsuit is retaliation, pure and simple. It's her final attempt to punish Shanda for having the audacity to love me and to punish me for finally standing up to her manipulation." Constance's lawyer tried to paint Stephen as mentally unstable himself, as a man having a breakdown and making irrational choices, but Stephen's testimony was too calm, too detailed, too supported by evidence. When the lawyer suggested Stephen was being manipulated by Shanda, Stephen's response was sharp and clear. "Shanda wanted nothing from me. She disappeared after I rejected her, changed her number, resigned from my company. She lived in poverty rather than ask me for help. She nearly died alone because she believed keeping Samuel away from me was protecting him from feeling unwanted. The only person who manipulated anyone in this situation was my mother." The final blow came when Stephen's lawyer called Constance to the stand and asked direct questions about her actions. Had she known about Samuel's existence? Yes. Had she informed her son? No. Had she interfered with medical insurance claims? The question hung in the air while Constance's lawyer scrambled to object, but the judge overruled and demanded an answer. Constance's silence was damning. Her mask of composure finally cracked as she realized she'd lost control of the narrative. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Constance's petition for grandparent rights was denied completely. A restraining order was issued, prohibiting her from contacting Shanda or Samuel without explicit written permission from both parents. The judge recommended a criminal investigation into insurance fraud and harassment. In carefully worded legal language, the judge made it clear that Constance had weaponized the legal system to harm her own grandchild, and such actions would not be tolerated. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed trying to get statements. Constance was escorted away by her lawyers, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. Stephen found Shanda sitting on a bench away from the crowd, holding Samuel and crying with relief so profound her whole body shook. He sat beside her without asking permission, his arm going around her shoulders, and she leaned into him like she'd been holding herself upright through sheer will and could finally let someone else help carry the weight. "It's over," she whispered against his shoulder. "She can't hurt us anymore." Stephen kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair and their son. "It's over, and I meant what I said in there. About loving you, about choosing you and Samuel over everything else. I meant all of it." Shanda pulled back enough to look at his face, her eyes searching for truth she was learning to believe in again. "You lost your inheritance today, your position in society, your mother. Your whole world changed because you testified against her." Stephen cupped her face, his thumb wiping away tears. "I lost those things months ago when I rejected you. Today I just made it official, and I'd make the same choice 1,000 times if it meant keeping you and Samuel safe." Samuel reached for both of them, little hands grabbing at Stephen's tie and Shanda's hair, and they wrapped around their son together. Not a perfect family, not a healed family yet, but a family that was learning to survive together instead of apart. And in that moment, with cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions they ignored, it was enough. Chapter 10. The woman he lost and the mother who destroyed Stephen had spent months learning that some doors close forever, but he'd never stopped hoping that Shanda's door might open again, even if it was just to say goodbye. 3 weeks after the court victory, Stephen arrived at Shanda's coastal house for what was supposed to be a casual dinner with Samuel. They'd been building something fragile in the weeks following the trial, a routine where Stephen came several times a week to be with his son, while Shanda cautiously let him back into their lives. But when he knocked on the door, it was Janelle who answered, her face tight with worry that immediately sent Stephen's heart into his throat. "Where's Shanda?" he demanded, already pushing past Janelle into the house. "Where's Samuel?" Janelle's hand on his arm stopped him, her voice quiet but urgent. "Shanda collapsed this morning. Severe abdominal pain. They rushed her to the hospital and found internal scarring from her traumatic delivery. She needs emergency surgery, Stephen. The same operating room, the same type of procedure. She's terrified because last time she almost didn't wake up." Stephen felt the world tilt beneath him. "Samuel." His voice came out strangled. Janelle gestured to the living room where their son was sleeping in a portable crib, peaceful and unaware that his mother was fighting for her life again. "I've been watching him, but I need to get back to the hospital. Shanda's asking for you. She's scared, Stephen. She made me promise to bring you." The hospital was the same one where Samuel had spent his first months, where Stephen had discovered his son's existence, where so much pain had happened. Stephen raced through familiar corridors with Samuel, secure in a carrier against his chest, Janelle leading him to the surgical wing. They found Shanda in pre-op, groggy from medication but conscious, her eyes finding Stephen the moment he entered the room. "You came," she whispered, and the relief in her voice made Stephen's chest crack open. He moved to her bedside, adjusting Samuel's carrier so she could see their son. "Of course I came. I'm here, Shanda. I'm not going anywhere." Her hand found his, her grip weak but desperate. "I'm scared," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "Last time I went into surgery, I didn't know if I'd wake up. I didn't know if Samuel would survive. I'm terrified that this time I won't be lucky, that Samuel will grow up without me, that I've finally survived everything just to lose it all now." Stephen sat carefully on the edge of her bed, his free hand cupping her face while Samuel dozed against his chest. "You're going to survive this because you're the strongest person I've ever known. You survived my rejection, survived nearly dying once already, survived months of fighting for Samuel alone. This is just one more battle, and you're going to win it." His voice broke as he continued, "But if you're scared, I'm here. I'm holding our son and I'm here with you, and you're not facing this alone." Shanda's eyes locked onto his, searching for truth she'd learned to doubt. "Promise me something. If anything happens to me, promise you'll tell Samuel about me. Not just that I loved him, but that I fought for him every single day. That he was wanted, that he was loved more than anything. Promise me. He'll know he was never a burden or a mistake." Stephen's vision blurred with tears. "Nothing's going to happen to you. But I promise. I promise Samuel will know how incredible his mother is, how you saved his life, and how you're the reason he exists and thrives." They wheeled Shandar away toward surgery, and Stephen was left in the waiting room with Samuel and Janelle, and 6 hours of terror that brought back every nightmare from the months his son had spent fighting for survival. He paced with Samuel, fed him bottles when he woke hungry, changed diapers with the practiced efficiency he'd learned during NICU visits. Samuel said "Mama" for the first time, while Stephen was walking circles around the waiting room, and Stephen cried so hard he had to sit down, his son patting his wet face with tiny, concerned hands. "She's going to be okay," Janelle said, sitting beside him, but her voice was uncertain. "She has to be okay." Stephen nodded, his throat too tight for words. He thought about Shandar coding on an operating table while he'd been signing merger documents. Thought about her waking up alone last time to learn her son might not survive. Thought about all the moments he'd missed because he'd been too much of a coward to choose love over fear. He couldn't lose her now, not after finally understanding what actually mattered. When the surgeon finally emerged, Stephen stood so fast he almost dropped Samuel. The doctor's face was tired, but smiling. "She's stable. The surgery went well. We repaired the scarring and she should make a full recovery." Stephen's legs gave out, his body folding back into the chair with relief, so intense he thought he might pass out. Janelle was crying beside him, and Samuel was reaching for everyone with concern written all over his little face. They let Stephen into recovery when Shanda woke up, and he carried Samuel to her bedside. She looked grey and exhausted, but her eyes were clear and focused on their son. "Hi, baby," she whispered, her hand reaching weakly for Samuel. Stephen carefully positioned himself so she could touch their son while he held him safely. "He said Mama while you were in surgery. First time. He was asking for you." Shanda's tears came fast and hard, mixing with laughter that sounded like freedom. "He said Mama." Stephen nodded, his own eyes wet. "He knows who you are. He knows you're his whole world." Shanda's gaze shifted to Stephen, and something in her expression had changed. The walls she'd built so carefully were cracking, letting light through in ways that made Stephen's heart race with hope and terror. "You stayed," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Through the whole surgery. You held Samuel and you stayed." Stephen's voice was rough when he responded. "Where else would I be? You're my family. Both of you. There's nowhere else I'd rather be than right here." Shandar was quiet for a long moment, just looking at him with eyes that were learning to trust again. Then she spoke words that changed everything. "I forgive you." The statement hung between them, simple and devastating and more powerful than any legal document or dramatic gesture. Stephen's breath caught in his throat. "What?" Shandar's hand found his across Samuel's small body. "I forgive you for rejecting us, for not being there when we needed you, for being too broken to fight for us at first. I'm choosing to forgive you because holding on to anger is exhausting, and I don't want Samuel to grow up in a home filled with resentment. I'm choosing to believe that people can change, that you've proven you're different than the man who walked away." Stephen couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. Shandar continued, her voice getting stronger despite her exhaustion. "I'm not saying everything is fixed. I'm not saying the damage is erased or that we go back to what we had before. But I'm saying I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see if we can build something new from the pieces we broke. I'm willing to let you back in completely, not just as Samuel's father, but as someone I might love again someday." Stephen climbed carefully into the hospital bed beside her, Samuel between them like he'd been that first night Stephen held him and wrapped his arms around both of them. "I'm going to spend every day earning that forgiveness," he promised against her hair. "I'm going to prove that I'm worthy of you and Samuel. I'm going to show you that choosing us over everything else was the easiest decision I've ever made." Shanda curled into him, careful of her surgical pain, and Samuel yawned contentedly between his parents. "Your mother is going to hate this," she said with a weak laugh. Stephen's arms tightened around them both. "My mother is no longer part of my life. She tried to destroy the most precious things I'll ever have, and she failed. The company, the inheritance, the legacy she wanted me to protect. I don't care about any of it. This right here, holding both of you, This is the only legacy that matters. They stayed like that for hours. A small family curled together in a hospital bed, healing from wounds that went deeper than surgery could reach. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where everything was magically fixed. Shandar still had trauma to work through, trust to rebuild slowly over months and years. Stephen still had patterns to break, instincts to unlearn, a lifetime of his mother's poison to cleanse from his thinking. Samuel would grow up knowing his parents' story, would learn about complicated choices and second chances, and love that survived despite everything. But they would face it together. Not perfect, not undamaged, but committed to building something real from the ruins of what Stephen had destroyed and what Shandar had survived. And that commitment, that choice to keep trying despite fear and pain and uncertainty, was worth more than any empire built on cruelty or any legacy that required sacrificing love to maintain. This was the life Stephen had almost thrown away, and he would spend every remaining day grateful that Shandar had been brave enough to let him try again.